Well, it's Friday and I'm back with Bible journaling, using some of the suggestions you guys gave me in the group. This week I'm usually I try to group the same book and lots of different chapters in that book. But this week I thought I'd just go with 3 different suggestions from 3 different people. And what my intention was they weren't really going to be related. It was just random. But when I was doing it, man, girls, it's like... No matter how long you study the Bible, it's just so amazing to see how things work together. And literally, I'm going to do a chapter out of Kings, out of Daniel, and out of 1 John, and they all tell the same basic story. You can see God woven throughout. They're so connected. And so that's what I love about reading the Bible and teaching you guys is so much of us growing up, we feel like everything is so disconnected from one another. It feels like a bunch of fairy tales coming together, so it's hard to relate to it. And the more I get into it, the more I see these connections. So I just want to show you an example of that today with 3 different suggestions people gave me in 3 completely different sections of the Bible. So if you're taking notes with me, today we're going to start in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 7. And what's happening at this point in the Bible is King Solomon is building his palace and the temple for God. So if you remember back in the Old Testament, there was the tabernacle that the Israelites built. It was that movable tent where they'd worship God when they were in the wilderness. And then now years later, whoop, I lost my light. Now, years later, that they've established a kingdom, they have their own king, they need a permanent structure to worship God. So instead of this tabernacle that moves everywhere, they're going to build a temple. And Solomon is the one who's in charge of that. So here we are in chapter 7, and this is very, this chapter is just like reading a blueprint, basically. There's not much depth to it. It's just, I want you to read it looking at the detail in a way of not, I need to build this or know the specifications, but just how much detail was put into this temple. There are chapters and chapters and chapters on this, and even the amount of detail just in the first section, I'm not going to outline the entire chapter because there is so much detail. So I want to challenge you to keep going. So I'm going to show you what I'd outlined for chapter 7. I'll just read this section for you all the way to verse 12 and then show you how I broke down my notes. So chapter 7, it says, Solomon builds his palace. It took Solomon 13 years, however, to complete the construction of his palace. He built the palace of the forest of Lebanon, 100 cubits long, 50 wide and 30 high, with 4 rows of cedar columns supporting trimmed cedar beams. It was roofed with cedar above the beams that rested on the columns, 45 beams, 15 to a row. Its windows were placed high in sets of 3 facing each other. All the doorways had rectangular frames. They were in the front parts in sets of 3 facing each other. He made a colonnade 50 cubits long and 30 wide. In front of it was a portico, and in front of that were pillars and an overhanging roof. He built the throne hall, the hall of justice, where he was to judge, and he covered it with cedar from floor to ceiling. And the palace in which he was to live, set farther back, was similar in design. Solomon also made a palace like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had married. All these structures, from the outside to the great courtyard and from foundation to eaves, were made of blocks of high-grade stone cut to size and smoothed on their inner and outer faces. The foundations were laid with large stones of good quality, some measuring 10 cubits and some 8. Above were high-grade stones cut to size and cedar beams. The great courtyard was surrounded by a wall of 3 courses of dressed stone and 1 course of trimmed cedar beams, as was the inner courtyard of the temple of the Lord with its portico. So I'm just reading that first little section, and that was like, your eyes might have glazed over, and that's okay, but that's because that's how detailed it's being about all the intricacies he put into this. And he's using high quality stone and cedar beams. And as you keep reading the temple furnishings, he's going to be using all these intricate decorations and these pillars everywhere. They're going to have panels with designs in them, lions, bulls, cherubim, pomegranates. They're going to have, just read it. The chapter before is preparations for building the temple. Solomon builds the temple. He builds the temple before he builds his own palace, is another testament to his humility and wisdom. The temple furnishings, and then it goes into the ark, the details of the Ark of the Covenant that's brought into the temple. So if you want to and then he has a prayer of dedication. So there's several chapters about this temple and its furnishings. So what I want you to do with this section, which is what I did, was I just went through and tried to highlight in orange or one color the main structures of what he built. So I see the palace of the Forest of Lebanon, a colonnade, a throne hall called the Hall of Justice, his palace where he lived, and a palace for his wife, Pharaoh's daughter. There's a great courtyard outside and an inner courtyard. So I'm like breaking apart the sections. And then what I did was just kind of took notes on the details of that. And I kind of forgot to keep highlighting, but the orange was the main structures. And then I had done the yellow was just the details. So doorways, windows, beams, portico, pillars, an overhanging roof, cedar from floor to ceiling, high grade stone, large stones, good quality, trimmed cedar beams, portico. So all I'm doing is kind of the main points in the orange, the details in the yellow. And then what I did was just kind of organize that over here. So I wrote Solomon's Palace, took 13 years. That's what it said in the first verse. And then I wrote out it was 7 structures that I counted. And then I wrote a couple details about it. And these talk about cubits. I'm not familiar with cubits. I can't translate that for you quickly, like as a math problem. What's the word I'm thinking of? So what you do is make sure to use these footnotes. There's footnotes all over this section. So what I did right here, the footnotes for the Palace of the Forest of Lebanon is 100 cubits long, 50 wide, and 30 high. And then it has a footnote down here. 150 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. And then it even has it in meters if you're not in the US. So I wrote it down in my system that I'm used to, 150 feet by 75 by 45, so that I get a better visual of what I'm reading. So there's all kinds of information in here for you to write down. The temple furnishings, you can take notes the same exact way. Use the footnotes. You might even have commentary in yours. And another thing is if you Google it or you have any kind of reference book, they're going to have a picture of Solomon's temple. It's a big deal in the Bible. It's referenced all over the place. I use this one, the Rose Book of Bible Charts, Maps, and Timelines, just to kind of get some more background. And this is a super cool illustration of the detail that they discuss and being able to visualize what in the world they're talking about. And then this book also has the verses that all this stuff was found, and the next page is all those little labels. It gives you a description of them. So this covers all those chapters from 1 Kings and some in 2 Samuel that talk about the temple, which is really cool to look at these resources as well. In my Bible timelines, when you go over to 1 Kings, remember this is just an overview of the entire book, so I'm not going to have this kind of detail in my timelines, but I do have a reference to it. So if you're wanting to dig more into the background, you would just flip over to that book of the Bible, and I have a section reminding you that Solomon builds the temple, and this will give you some background information. David and Bathsheba, their son was Solomon. And so David had a lot of kids, not always with the same person, but Solomon is actually the son of Bathsheba, the famous story. And then it tells you about the life of King Solomon, some more information, and that's where he built the temple. And then also you can go over to the books of Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs and learn a little bit more about King Solomon, because he wrote both of those books. Okay, so the next thing that was requested, let's flip over to Daniel. So we're going to go into the book of Daniel, chapter 5. So I'm looking at Daniel chapter 5. This is after King Solomon has died. It's been hundreds of years. The kingdom has split, and all those Israelites that lived under his rule have now been dispersed. They're exiled all over. And so I believe they're in Babylon. This group, or where Daniel is Babylon. And there's a King Belshazzar. So that's where we are. Daniel in the lion's den hasn't happened yet, but it's the same Daniel. And so King Belshazzar is the ruler. And I just want you to notice that the temple is a main character in this story as well, which wasn't intentional that I picked it to go with it. It was just 2 suggestions people had. So that's really cool. So I'm going to read a little bit of this, not the entire chapter, but this is Daniel chapter 5. And then I want you to just look on the side. I'm just taking some background notes of the characters, the setting, the time, some viewpoints going on. And then I'll go over here to this side and talk about, all right, what's the stories, like from a literary sense? What's the problem? What's the solution? What's God's role in the story? So I'm going to read a little bit of this. You could check out my notes or take them while you're listening. This story is called The Writing on the Wall. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the kings and his nobles, his wives and concubines, might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So, if you remember, they took the best of the best and put it in the temple. The temple is for worshiping God. It's for honoring God. Now you've got a new king who has taken over. He has no respect or knowledge of this temple. He just knows it's covered in gold and precious jewels. And so he decides to throw a big party and drinks his wine out of these fancy goblets taken from the temples. So God is not happy because he's also praising false gods with these goblets he's drinking the wine out of. So here's what God does. And so these are kind of, the yellow represents like the characters that I was trying to color code, and this orange represents how God steps in, this big event that happens that I wanted to notice. So it says, suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote, and his face turned pale, and he was so frightened his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. And so I'm going to skip this section, but basically what happens is the king gets completely freaked out. He sees this floating hand writing something on the wall. And so he pulls everyone he knows in and says, what does this say? What does it say on the wall? I don't know what this says. Nobody knows. And I believe it's the queen that says, I heard about this guy, Daniel. You should ask him. I heard he's really wise and can interpret stuff. So move over to this side. And so I highlighted this section I want to read. Daniel was brought before the king. The king said to him, I've heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they couldn't explain it. So in verse 17, it says, oh wait, let's see. Okay, let's go to verse 18. Here Daniel talks to King Belshazzar. He says in verse 18, Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and people of every language dreaded and feared him. When his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. So skip down to verse 22. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. And then he tells him all the stuff he just did that he shouldn't have done. And then here we go in the pink. I've highlighted that in a different color because this is the inscription that was on the wall. So back here, it doesn't tell you what's on the wall. Right here, when he interprets it, it shows you what's on the wall. And basically, he interprets these these 3 words, and it's terrible news for the king. But the king is so excited that he has an answer. He gives Daniel he rewards him with the 3rd highest position over the kingdom. So basically it says, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. You've been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So here's the problem that I wrote. We've got the goblet. He takes the goblets from the temples. He parties with them and he thanks his false gods. Then I wrote drew a hand writing something. God steps in. So these colors are God stepping in. The mysterious hand writes message on the wall and the king can't interpret it. So the solution is that Daniel explains the meeting and the prophecy is fulfilled right away by the king being murdered by a new ruler. If you'll keep reading to the end of this chapter, it says, then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. So he immediately that night is killed, and the Medo-Persian Empire begins. So yeah, I thought that was very interesting that these 2 stories went together. It's good to note the character because you'll read the other characters in the other sections of the Bible, and it's a good reminder to just kind of try to quiz yourself on what you remember. Also, I keep hitting that button, sorry. I use my timelines to help me remember those things as well. So if you flip over to Daniel when you're studying the book of Daniel, it will give you an overview as well of who Daniel is, why he's important, and then kind of the timeline of when all this occurred. So you can look in the book of Daniel just to see that timeline. Okay, last one is 1 John chapter 3. And this one does not mention the temple, but it's a section talking about the children of God and the children of the devil. And how do you know if you're a child of God or if you're a child of the devil? And what I was noticing was all these things that were in this section of 1 John, the children of God, are things that Daniel was doing, are things that Solomon were doing. And all the things of the children of the devil were things that the king what's his name? Belteshazzar? I already forgot it. And his dad, King Nebuchadnezzar, were. So you can see the story reflected. It's warning us about these character traits we need to take on. And those stories we just read are an example of what that looks like in real life. Okay, so let me read chapter 3 real quick. And then I just want you could take notes on what I've got here while I'm reading. But basically what I did was I made 2 headings, children of God and children of the devil. And when I saw something that was a reflection of a true child of God, I highlighted it in green, and pink for the children of the devil, the things that I thought were sinful or not of God. So I grouped them like that as I read it. And then I just rewrote them in a quick little phrase according to the category it went into. And then I did highlight verse 8 in a different color and pulled that verse out at the bottom because I felt like it was a really, really good summary of this entire section. So I'm going to read it. You can take notes while I'm reading that. See what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God, and that is what we are. The reason the world does not know us is it did not know him. Dear friends, now we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known. But we know that when Christ appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. All who have this hope in him purify themselves just as he is pure. Everyone who sins breaks the law. In fact, sin is lawlessness. But you know that he appeared so that he might take away our sins. And in him is no sin. No one who lives in him keeps on sinning. No one who continues to sin has either seen him or known him. Dear children, do not let anyone lead you astray. The one who does what is right is righteous, just as he is righteous. The one who does what is sinful is of the devil, because the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's work, and that's the verse that I highlighted in yellow. No one who is born of God will continue to sin, because God's seed remains in them. They cannot go on sinning because they have been born of God. This is how we know who the children of God are and who the children of the devil are. Anyone who does not do what is right is not God's child, nor is anyone who does not love their brother and sister. Verse 11. For this is the message you heard from the beginning. We should love one another. Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. Do not be surprised, my brothers and sisters, if the world hates you. We know that we've passed from death to life because we love each other. Anyone who does not love remains in death. Anyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life residing in him. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. This is how we know that we belong to the truth and how we set our hearts at rest in his presence. If our heart condemns us, we know that God is greater than our hearts and he knows everything. Dear friends, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have confidence before God and receive from him anything we ask because we keep his commands and do what pleases him. And this is his command, to believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and to love one another as he commanded us. The one who keeps God's commands lives in him and he in them. And this is how we know he lives in us. We know it by the Spirit he gave us. So I hope that's encouragement to you this weekend as you go into your time of maybe, hopefully, some rest, and are able to reflect on the goodness of God, the glory that he deserves. I will post these notes in my Facebook group on Monday. And if you're watching this from YouTube, you can join my Facebook group through the link in the notes. And if you're in my Facebook group, just check back on Monday to see these notes. I'll keep the video up, but the actual images, those are what I'm talking about, will come out on Monday. So also, if you look up in 1 John, in my timelines as well. And the reason I reference these is because these are all my notes that I've personally taken. So I constantly refer to them, and as you see, I'm just building on them. So you don't want to reinvent the wheel. All that work you've done with your own personal note-taking and workbooks and Bible studies and journaling, keep all that stuff handy so you can reference it so that you're growing and not having to relearn everything constantly. That's why kids have homework at school, is to re-practice those things. That's why teachers want you to read over the summer so you don't forget everything you've learned. Same thing with Bible study. Use those practices you learned in school to help you build on your knowledge so that you can grow. I did want to point out that in my 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John paper, there is a section right here on this chapter that we just talked about. It says in 1 John, he addresses dear children several times. He also addresses dear friends several times. And so it wrote out those. But what we just read was the children section. And it says, dear children, don't sin. He's forgiven sins. You've known the Father. Continue in him. Don't let anyone lead you astray. Love with actions and truth. You are from God, and keep yourselves from idols. Those are all the things he started the sentence with, dear children. So there's always extra stuff in there that you can check out. Of course, there's a million resources at your local bookstore. I always am wanting to hear about what you're using and what you want to study next. So make sure to drop a comment, and I will see you next week. Thank you. Have a great weekend.